What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with the birthday girl, Dr. Layla Brown, and you're tuned into season 2, episode 9 of The Last Open Intellectual.
So we got a lot of new patrons this week, and so
I want
to shout out I Am Clear as Mud, Evan Smith, Lisa Z. Winters, Mookie Ali, Michael Craig, and Sounds of Saint Elsewhere. Thank you all for tuning in, for giving us your coins, and as always, helping us to pay our producer.
Shout out to Dr. Winters, fellow Berkeley Bear, African Diaspora Studies PhD. Appreciate you.
This shit is like just off the top today basically, but so I had this concept, just a thought really. It's not a concept. It's not that well fleshed out. Maybe we can flesh it out now, but sometimes when we get on Twitter or really social media, some of us who would call ourselves on the left or politicos or whatever we want to call ourselves, sometimes I think there's a danger of gossiping, but we like to cover it in politics. So if it's something that's politically related, if we want to call somebody out on the name, if we want to talk shit about them, we just use it. We don't like their politics as cover to pretty much sip tea. So I'm curious if what y'all thoughts are on that, what the implications are of doing that, sometimes what messages that might send, especially to people who might be new to stuff like this, who get gassed up because they take it more seriously than some of us who probably know we're gossiping. What it just kind of how we see that playing out.
I don't really be in the Twitterverse like that. So can you give an example?
Can I give an example?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think there's a billion examples, but I think it's hard to like figure out what's what, because that's why I think it's a problem, because you can't actually just be somebody who's really serious about your politics and you just go hard on people, and then there have other folks who you just don't like them. If AOC wears a dress to a party, if you want a more specific example about tax the rich, some of us have real legitimate disagreements with that. Some of us are just gossiping. You know.
Yeah. I mean, I think I have a number of thoughts about this, because so for example, if we think about this in a historical context, and I'm thinking kind of about this because I was posting about some books about Marcus Garvey, and a few people were really on my head about that. And so, some people brought up legitimate things like him meeting with the KKK or whatever. And then other people are like, oh, he's colorist, or he had a light-skinned wife. So that's where it can get gossipy, where it's like you point out personal things in their life and try to make it about their politics. Personal is political notwithstanding, but people do it with MLK, like, well, fuck him, he loved white folks and he was fucking with that white bitch or whatever. You know what I'm saying? So like, this is the type of stuff that does tend to happen when it comes to, as you're saying, targeting people whose politics we don't like, but instead of sticking to the politics, I think isn't this like called the straw man argument in debate, where you attack the person instead of actually critiquing their politics?
That's an ad hominem attack. Yeah.
Ad hominem. There you go.
I mean, I don't know. I am not a go at people debate on Twitter or social media type of person. So I've never really even quite understood the impetus to have those kinds of back and forth. Which, I mean, and when I say that, I mean about personal stuff. Like, I do think that there are occasions when I feel like there's a necessity for clarity. Some things are misinterpreted, but I don't necessarily, when it comes to personal attacks, I don't know. I don't know what we get out of it. So I don't really follow it too much.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, for the record, it's not just Twitter. I think Twitter is a good example because you can find it countlessly. But I think even preceding Twitter, I think we still have seen this where, I mean, for some people, politics is no different than sports or a TV show. Like, they don't really care about the implications of it, So it's like the fact that people die behind these things, the fact that, lives are made or taken behind these things, I don't think is as important for some folks as just being right or as just proving whatever their side is. And then, like CBS said, I think you find it's easier, I think, to identify when it does become personal attacks. And people think because I don't like whatever you say, I can throw that in now. Like, so people who are like, I'm against ableism all of a sudden become very ableist when they're speaking about somebody they don't like, or they become fat phobic when they're speaking about somebody they don't like, or they're misogynistic. All of a sudden, this stuff starts coming out, and people cherry pick ideas or cherry pick certain types of behavior. Like we talk about sometimes with the Panthers. Like, it's not that the Panthers were perfect by any means, but I think there's clearly sometimes where people are cherry picking what they don't like about the Panthers, acting as if every chapter in the Panthers was the same, which is not true as well. Usually they're talking about California Panthers, they're talking about leadership, and they use that as a criticism of the entire group. But it's not, I don't think often it's politics. You're not trying to advance anything other than just whatever your side of the thing is. And when we talking about gossiping, that's all we doing. We just laughing, we just kikiing about some shit that we think is funny. And that's cool to do here and there. Like, I'm not saying I'm above that, but I think it's bad to pass that off as being some type of politic or something radical or anything else.
When in the last presidential election, when Kamala was running, and one of the things I just refused to do was be a part of the dragging her about her blackness. I don't know. People change. People identify more as black as they get older. I mean, not older, but as time goes on. But one of the things that I felt like there were enough things to solidly critique Kamala on, to push back against her presidency. And I don't know, I was not interested in engaging in the conversation about publicly about whether or not she really saw herself as black, whether or not she was using that as a tool to get elected or whatever. And so, I mean, I guess in that regard, I can, I have a sense of the point that you're getting at in terms of like sometimes just having beef with people. But the thing is, if you have legitimate beef, why sully it with these things that, are so wishy-washy? So either way, so I don't know. Like for me, that was just something that I refused to engage in during that campaign, just to talk too much about how she identified, because it didn't really matter because there was enough fuckery going on.
But even the whole like Kamala thing, right? So I think that there's a legitimate critique of mass and hyper incarceration, the prison industrial complex. But there's even a way in which that Kamala thing was also circulating in that gossipy way, where it's like, she threw black moms in prison, but it's like you actually have no real commitment to abolition or to defund or any anti-carceral politics at all. But it's like, well, fuck her because she was a cop, right? You know what I mean? So it's kind of, it operates in the same way. It's not rooted in any real political commitment or any real concern about the harm that she would do as an elected official, but rather just, a pile on because you don't like Kamala and you ain't got no politics for real. So you just repeat what other people are saying.
Yeah, I think that's another implication. It's like you don't have to actually form any real politic or any real opinion about things. You just kind of can become the echo chamber of what someone else said, and that's when I think it's very obvious that it's just gossip.
But this is where I think that this is actually where I think the idea that the person was political is actually helpful. It's not only that, but I do think in some of the ways that we choose to engage our personal relationships, like even Sharice, you talk about the concept of mutual comradeship. Like, I think there are ways to think about how we can engage our own politics on a so-called like micro or local level. I mean, and it is a conundrum to think about ourselves as anti-capitalists when we are, when we live in a capitalist world, and we have to be complicit in capitalist structures to a certain degree and extent in order to survive. But to daily be against those types of things, I think is, on the one hand is about finding interpersonal ways to not replicate these sort of extractive and exploitative ways of relating to one another. For me, that's one of the ways. I don't by any means think that that's wholly sufficient, but I do think that there is something to be said for shifting our own types of politics in the way we engage our family, our friends, our sort of, even for us, me and you, CBS, as teachers, our classroom structures, when we think about what it means to shift relational power dynamics, even if they're in, very sort of small micro types of ways, I think that is one of the ways where we can think about what it means to live out our politics in a sort of everyday kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, I think we always talk about contradictions on the left, whatever that is. But we talk about contradictions, particularly amongst the materialist left. So it's like, um, there's always a compromise by just living under capitalism. But I reject the kind of reductionist idea that because you live under it, you can't like have any other values other than capitalism. It's like when people are like, well, you're on an iPhone right now, or you're on an Android, so you can't hate capitalism, or but it's like no one's, even just simple stuff like nobody says because there's a Democrat in office that you're a Democrat if you're a Republican. Like nobody says silly stuff like that, because we understand that you can have whatever belief system you want. You can join a party, even if in the sense of, if you're a communist, you're not going to win any elections in America. But I'm just saying you have options to believe in things. Nobody says if you're a Christian in a Muslim nation that you can't be a Christian because everybody's a Muslim. Like that argument just doesn't really hold up. So I definitely think that, we can have our beliefs or our values or our political ideologies regardless of what we're under. As far as how we live that out, I mean, like we're not getting to any of these things that we believe in any one Thanos snap or anything like that anyway. Like there has to be, like, it's not necessarily gradualism, but we do have to struggle through things, right? Like, so the way we relate to each other is important, and that's reflected in our own personal lives as well in our organizations. Like we've talked off air about how sometimes people throw around the term like join an organization or whatever, and how sometimes that doesn't that may or may not be sufficient depending on the situation. But those are places where we would like to work those things out. So if we cannot treat our people good in organizations, then we're not really going to get anywhere. Like we're treating our people like shit. That's how we set those models. That's how we set those ideas for us to enact. Like, but it can't just be a personal thing. I think that's my criticism sometimes of how the personal as political gets played out is I don't really have to join and struggle with anybody. I just have to work on myself, and then it becomes this kind of more rehabilitation project, and then it's like recycling or something. Like I use blue bags for my trash, or I buy non-gluten food, or it becomes that kind of neoliberal activism where it's like, no, we're trying to set a different relationality to ourselves so we can get into a society where we would be able to do something else. But you can't have socialism, or definitely not communism, if everybody is selfish. Nobody cares about each other. Like we have to have those better relationships, even hold up a society like that.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess in thinking about like relations within organizations or within entities, we've spoken about problematic relationships that we've had in entities and organizations. But I think that to your the broader point that you brought up about sort of gossip and politics is sort of like, to what end some people can be really good on particular material aspects, right? They can really embody some aspects of being a nationalist or a Pan-Africanist or a communist or a socialist, but then there's still ways to go on gender, sexuality, maybe ableism. And so I think, it's really, really hard. It seems like, even especially in the sort of time in which we're in, it's hard to hold those things together, that people are flawed. You know what I mean? And so part and parcel of that like gossip aspect of politics is like completely disavowing that somebody is what they say they are because they have those contradictions. Now, when it gets into the realm of like violence and real harm, bodily or emotional or otherwise, I think that that's something else. But it's also as if something about that a lot of people comment on the left, and put it in terms of comment or cancel culture or wokeism, is like the what is it, the virtue signaling and the moralism that can come with that, which would mean that if you're not perfect, then you're not this thing, right? If you don't check all the boxes, like you're not this thing. And I think that's also a sort of shows a political immaturity, right? That people have contradictions, but then the other side to that is that when you have those contradictions, your politic comes out in terms of being accountable, or in terms of being willing to, I won't say use the word submit, but being willing to Just, I don't know, I guess for lack of a better term, like have accountability to a collective when those things get called out,
But I don't think you're wrong
to get better.
But I don't think you're wrong even to use the term submit, because the thing is, submit is not it's not in that instance. It is about acknowledging that there is some greater either good and or harm than yourself. And so when you're not submitting to a person, you're submitting to the ideas that you have committed yourself to. And as long as the entity that you belong to is attempting to enact or hold those ideals true, then that's what you're submitting to. You're not submitting to people. You are committing yourself to be, like you said, being held accountable for the behaviors or other things that you engage in that contradict the very things that you say you are about, right? So I mean, I think that like that, and that's always hard. Nobody likes to be wrong or to be called out, but there's also like there's something for that process of humility. Humility, like we do have to be able to engage and allow ourselves to think enough of the people we work with, we organize with, we gather with, to be able to say, maybe this ain't flying. And what does it mean to belong to an organization that you don't trust to hold you accountable to the very principles that you all claim you have in common? Now, one of two things is going on. Either y'all don't actually have those things in common, or you don't actually trust the people that you with. And both of those are problematic for building any kind of future together.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think we're just talking about engaging in struggle, right? I'm saying, like, if we truly believe that that's what this is about, is actually engaging in struggle, not in the abstract, but in real life, and also just like that things are worked out through that, whether it means we don't work together because we don't work, or it means we can work together. We only learn that through going through that struggle. And if we also understand that that's also just how people are living their lives, like they're not just making like purely moral choices that don't have any consequences. Like people are making choices based on the material reality that they live in, and that is what compromises them, particularly when you live under capitalism. That's just how contradictions work. Like, you know, in Mao's essay Contradictions, he talks about like the primary antagonisms and then more the secondary and other antagonisms. And I think sometimes when we're gossiping, all the antagonisms get collapsed as being the primary thing, even if it might be something that we could work out and struggle. If we're driving to a destination, there's like, you know, if the car doesn't work, we're not getting there, right? Like that's something we have to figure out. If you snore too loud on the way there, I don't know if that's worth like not like just ending the trip, you know? Like maybe we deal with that.
It is.
No, it's not.
Your ass is getting
and this is part
out.
of the problem.
I'm not going. But if you're really part of a collective, you would know the loud snorers prior and be in a different car, to extend that analogy. But snoring is a no for me. Because I see what you're saying, but hell no.
But I mean, I don't know. I'm saying if we're trying to get to a destination,
don't be distracted by her. Too like
say what?
I said, don't be distracted by her. The snoring is not ending the trip, okay? You know what? You can be annoyed for the whole 15 hours.
No, we can just, or I mean, but that's the thing. When people can't like deal with the other contradictions, you can just drop them off, leave them at the gas station, and you know they can get a ride themselves. You know, but we still going where we.
It's still Uber and Lyft. Drop me off. I'll grab my Doritos and keep it moving.
Yeah, but we still go where we go. It doesn't mean you have to also force the people like CBS who can't get over those other contradictions to stay in the car. But they're not going to stop the ride, right? Like, I think that's the overall point. If you don't want to deal with somebody snoring, cool. But don't try to tell me that that's the contradiction, that primary contradiction, as in that's the thing that everyone in the car should be primarily concerned with, versus that being your personal issue that you have to deal with on your own. Like, I think that is a good example where, like, if you don't like people that snore, maybe that's just something you need to deal with, as opposed to getting on Twitter or any other space and turning that into a politic to weaponize against an entire group of people and say we should just be off this, when it just may not be that deep. And if it is that deep, that's something, again, that we work out together in the car. Maybe we do say that's just a non-starter for everybody. But, like, that ain't something that one person gets to impose on everybody in the car.
I think that's such a good point. That's, like, such a good analogy, like, in terms of, because one thing about me, I hate some motherfucking snoring. But I also know that I've been on many trips where people snore and it's been fine. You know what I mean? And so it's also the sort of the other way that I think gossip or this bad faith, to your point about snoring, to just build that out further, you know, the other sort of contradiction or bad faith of this thing is when that particular malady, whatever, becomes a problem only when it's espoused by or when it's a characteristic of certain individuals, right? So snoring. So it's like you don't like when that motherfucker snore, but then you be all up under somebody else who snore all the time. And so, and I think that that's also how people who have immature politics operate as well. And it also relates to that Kamala example. So it's like Cop Mala, but your uncle's a cop and you love him and you always posting pictures with him in his fucking uniform or whatever, right? You love the cops in your family and support them all the time and go to their barbecues. So it's like, you know what I mean? So it's I'm just throwing that in the mix.
If you're gonna stand for something, I think you have to try to be consistent as you can. It's not that there won't be contradictions. That's just life. Like that's how this works. But you have to try to be consistent, because if the politic really matters, then when people, like, I've been in this space where like nobody agreed with me, and it helps if you still held a line, because they can change their mind. Again, if we believe in struggle, then people can work through contradictions and come to different conclusions. No one is in a static place, so you have to hold those lines. If you're just like, again, to take from mouth, you're just telling the people, right? Like you're just standing behind them, kind of just following whatever the trends are. Then you're not setting any examples. And I don't mean this in some kind of missionary way where you get the people to submit to your belief system. I'm talking about the politic itself beyond you as an individual. If we believe in that, then we have to be willing to set examples the best that we can, even if they're flawed, to get people towards that. Otherwise, it is, to me, just gossip.
Okay, y'all. So for this week's planting thoughts, we have one of my favorites, the Hoya caryi. So this is also known as the sweetheart plant. This particular plant is native to Southeast Asia and some of the Pacific Islands. And because of that, its natural habitat that it tends to do well in is the humid and warm climate. Now, the thing about this plant, let me pull it out. So the Hoyas in general as a varietal, they are vining plants. This particular plant can take years to actually vine. So in some instances, it can take up to 2, 3, 4 years to actually vine. They're often sold like this, and their plants are rooted, and you will need a node for it to vine. These particular plants, they are kind of fleshy. So for a lot of people will initially mistake them to be in the succulent family, but they are not. And they can vine, many, many feet. So for me, this particular plant, when I think about what types of thoughts it plants for me. So obviously, because it is a heart-shaped plant, it often makes me reflect on my own types of commitments, whether they be romantic or just intimate, and thinking about my commitments to having a life full of love. But what's also interesting to me about this is the type of patience that this particular plant requires. And it's interesting because unlike succulents, it requires a lot of patience, but it also needs a lot of humidity and water. So succulents you can kind of abandon, you can leave alone. But these are plants that really make you exercise a level of patience for them to do well. But that is this week's plant for planting thoughts, the Hoya caryi, or otherwise known as a sweetheart plant.
All right, y'all. As usual, we have such a dope interview this week with my friend, Dr. Davarian Baldwin, who is a leading urbanist, historian, and cultural critic. He serves as the Paul E. Rather Distinguished Professor of American Studies and founding director of the Smart City Labs, at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. He is the author of this wonderful book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower: How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities. He's also the author of Chicago's New Negroes, Modernity, the Great Migration, and Black Urban Life, and the co-editor with Minka Makalani of the essay collection Escape from New York, The New Negro Renaissance Beyond Harlem. He is currently working on the book Land of Darkness, Chicago and the Making of Race in Modern America. In addition to teaching and writing, Baldwin sits on a number of editorial boards, including Black Perspectives and the Journal of African American History. He is also co-editor of the Urban Life, Landscape, and Policy book series for Temple University Press, serves as a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians, and sits on the coordinating committee of Scholars for Social Justice and also Scholars for a New Deal in Higher Education. His opinions and commentaries have been featured in numerous outlets from NBC News, PBS, and the History Channel to USA Today, The Washington Post, and Time magazine. So as usual, we have accomplished, distinguished, dope people on this program. So welcome, Dr. Baldwin.
Hey, how y'all doing? Good to be here. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Course. Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
So to kick it off, can you just give us a sense of your own sort of personal intellectual trajectory that has included the study of the Chicago School of Sociology, the New Negro, and up to your sort of newest project, which examines the sort of problematics of the U.S. university?
Thank you so much. First, I want to just congratulate y'all on this amazing platform and for creating the space to have conversations like this and far beyond this. So first of all, I want to say, congrats on that. And now to directly answer your question, this all comes out of my upbringing. I grew up in a factory town in Wisconsin, small town, 35,000 people that had factories and a college. And before I even knew it, that was going to become a trajectory part of my life. I ended up going to graduate school in New York. And even when we didn't know we were urbanists, we were all urbanists. So when I went to get my first job in the history department, I didn't really see myself as an urbanist, but it was clear that was all over me. And so when you talked about those three areas, New Negro, Chicago School, and this recent work, it's a part of a larger, what I'm calling my urban knowledgeist trilogy that looks at the interface between kind of knowledge, intellectual and cultural production and urban space, particularly with the focus on the African diaspora communities as the cases. And so if we look at the kind of the line of thinking from the New Negro to experience to shift from Harlem to Chicago to focus not on kind of erudite traditional spheres of knowledge production like museums and salons and universities, but to look at kind of how Black migrants, working class, because my mother was a factory worker, my grandmother was a domestic, so to tell their story, I want to look at the role of Black migrants and how they turn to mass consumer culture as a site of both idea making and political protest in the realms of beauty culture, independent filmmaking, gospel music, sport, policy, gambling, etc. And so then when I moved to the second project, which was supposed to be the second project, but it's going to come out third because this university project became so urgent in the moment. But the second project in my mind that I had a contract for and everything was supposed to come out, but it was about the Chicago School of Sociology, because so much of the source material for Chicago's New Negroes was these really, jacked up representations of Black life by Chicago School sociologists. And so I wanted to read that work against the grain and say, okay, people celebrate that Chicago School was critical for, creating modern ideas about race. I said, wait a minute, what's actually going on here is that anxieties about race and racial difference in cities is constructing the Chicago School. We need to tell that story. So kind of a history from below, et cetera, of an institution. So what does it mean to examine and write a history of an institution from the perspective of those that made it in the surroundings? And so in a real way, this third book really follows or moves in that same way that most studies of higher education that interface higher education and political economy is really been written by either representatives of the university, so kind of like PR puff pieces, or public policy projects, so more mapping and macroeconomic policy work. And so this book is driven by over 150 interviews conducted over 15 years. And that really allowed me to get into my American studies bag in terms of really interdisciplinary work. I had been trained in interdisciplinary studies with American studies and primarily have been doing historical work. So this was my first full-length, more contemporary project that allowed me to do some light ethnography, mapping, other kinds of cultural analysis, political economy work more directly. It's always been there, but more directly. And so this, in a way, instead of looking at kind of the political economy and the encroachment and the expansion and the realities of higher education as a knowledge industry, as an industry, as an anchor institution, I want to look at it from the perspective of those living in the shadows of the Ivy Tower, Usually their stories, their perspectives, their voices are not in this conversation. So my analysis was that, who knows the university better than those who go there to work there every day, those who teach, those who try to navigate the campuses and not get caught up by campus police, and who go there to receive healthcare. And that's the story we need to be telling. I mean, it's already been kind of, some quantitative folk, what I call quantoids, have dismissed the work, saying it's more anecdotal. There's not enough data set analysis. And I'm like, that's fine, but there needs to be a conversation with the human component, the humanity. What does it mean to have a humanistic approach to these structural conditions? I mean, and of course that's all in there, but to focus on the experiences of everyday people, particularly Black and brown people, in examining the consequences of higher education's encroachment and infrastructure on our lives. So that's the trajectory. Yeah.
Continuing from my conversation with Treva, because I don't know. I mean, I think most of us are driven to our projects by this kinds of personal things that animate.
Oh yeah, autobiographical.
Exactly, but I don't necessarily know that men are always as explicit about what those connections are as I think women are when they talk about it. And so I just appreciated you including that in the way you think about what types of experiences you had and how that led you to ask certain types of questions.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, because that is definitely the way I think about it. But it probably is gendered in a way. I'm sure you're right. Mm-hmm.
So let's dive into your current work. So part of what you argue in The Shadow of the Ivory Tower is that universities take over cities in social, political, and economic ways, or as you put it, a city's, quote, financial resources, policing priorities, labor relations, and land values, end quote. And this especially seems to be the case in areas that have high levels of racialized and poor people. So can you speak a bit about how this actually happens, how this takes place? And then would it be fair to understand this as sort of akin to a form of like settler colonialism?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so the relationship between universities, political economy, as being facilitated through the exploitation of communities of color or racialized communities, as you put, goes back to the colonial era, as made very clear by my good colleague, Craig Wilder. But the ramping up or the solidification of that relationship really comes to crystallization in the Cold War, civil rights, Black freedom era. And it's interesting because we don't always talk about it in this way. So in the so-called Cold War era, you have the ramping up of what was called at the time, the military industrial academic complex. That's what it was actually called at the time because of the way in which academic research was being used to facilitate military weapon production and other things. But what we don't talk about on the other side, the battlefront at home, was the way in which higher education administrators got together and created a lobbying group to retrofit the Housing Act of 1949 to protect themselves from what they were calling the urban crisis. As Black and brown communities were surrounding urban campuses, they rejiggered the Housing Act policy of 1949 to get the federal government to offer $2 for every dollar invested in a city that was pushed to create urban development affiliated with a university. And so this is what we call later the 112 credits program. So this phenomena, particularly in Black and brown communities, all over the country, in a range of universities, ranging from University of Pennsylvania to University of Chicago, University of Alabama, Birmingham, the Aurora campus in Denver, all cleared whole blocks of Black and brown communities to create a residential and institutional buffer of university prosperity to keep growing Black and brown communities at bay. So this was the phenomenon, this was the flex for about 20 or 30 years. Then we get to, well, probably even longer, 40 years. So then we get to the 90s, and then there's this whole back to the city movement, that the children of suburban sprawl are interested in coming back to the city. And I lived through this in New York City. I was in New York during Giuliani time. I went to graduate school at NYU starting in 95, when special police order number 4 or number 9, whatever it was whooping Black and brown people's behinds for taking up too many seats on the train, for taking too long in the vestibule, for being squeegee boys, for kicking people that have mental health disabilities out of facilities and turning them into luxury housing. So cities all over the country were trying to capture this back to the city movement. So that's on one side. So trying to recreate or capture this tax base. On the other side, you had universities who were facing shrinking contributions from the state. And just to be clear, don't get it twisted that whether you're a public school or a private school, you receive public money, welfare money. And so at this point, you have interest convergence, because what was the idea that empty nesters and young professionals had of a city? What was that mentality? Coffee shops, walkability, fully wired, riverfront development, concerts, coffee shops, lectures, museums. So basically their idea of the city was what? It was a campus. So you had this phenomenal interest convergence between the ambitions of city leaders and the desires of university administrators to turn cities into campuses as a mechanism of value and wealth capture as these various individuals coming. It became so powerful in these surrounding neighborhoods and so easy because of a history of the connections between race and land value, talking about restrictive covenants, redlining, et cetera. And the story that I tell in the book is that we don't talk about how higher ed was a prime driver of many of these of urban policies that we all know to a certain level. And so what I'm saying here is that in this moment, in the present moment now, especially from the 90s to the present, when you have this moment of interest convergence, this is when you also have the rise of the knowledge economy. Now, what do I mean by that? Knowledge economy is where you're taking university research is being used to produce profitable goods and patents in a range of fields, from pharmaceuticals and software to military and defense weaponry. And a part of producing that wealth on these campuses was turning more and more blocks into what are now being called innovation districts or knowledge communities, right in the heart of Black and brown neighborhoods that were once seen as dangerous, that are now seen as profitable. But these universities have to retrofit these blocks in a way that makes them seem safe to students, researchers, and their investors. So the very same communities that have been that have been divested because of that racial divestment, now they're ripe for economic exploitation. So after years of turning their backs, now universities are stretching their legs to build, eat up, consume more and more of the city. And cities are handmaidens in the process as a means of developing what Richard Florida calls the creative economy, the creative class, what I call the knowledge economy, because I want to highlight the workers involved and the political economy. For him, it's more about a celebration of ethos and sentiment. For me, it's about political economic conditions. And so that's how we get here to the story and why, you know, right before our eyes, what I call the rise of universe cities. The center of the story is African American and Latinx, and to a less degree, indigenous communities, especially in the Southwest and in Canada, that are catching hell with this prosperity. This prosperity is being built on their backs as the low-wage workers on these campuses, as cafeteria workers, groundskeepers, support staff. They're being experimented upon in these hospitals. These hospitals are the primary healthcare providers, and yet they are being cagey about the indigent care they're supposed to offer, the subsidized care they're supposed to offer in exchange for their property tax, for their tax exemptions. And they are the major policers in these areas that are maintaining the blocks to demonstrate that these neighborhoods are open for business. So this gives life to what I call the rise of the universe city.
So I have two follow-up questions. One thing that you were talking about reminded me of how architecture is more and more being used at large universities as a recruitment tool. So I was at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign for my postdoc, and we were having a conversation about this because there's always more and more expansion. The other thing I was thinking about is, so, you know, I'm at University of Chicago on this postdoc, and they send all the safety updates, right? And so people are getting robbed around here a lot now, I think because it's holiday season and motherfuckers are getting money, fine, right? And so then they're like, always the last part of the email is policing patrols will increase in these areas, right? And so that's not a good segue into what I want to ask as a follow-up question, but I was just thinking about that as you were talking. But the question is, how did you choose which universities or which colleges to focus on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I opened the book with a story about how I came to the story, and you're in Hyde Park, so it's a militarized zone. That's what it really is. I was there doing historical research at the Regenstein Library, which you probably know pretty well. And I came out, and there was this major protest because the university had watched as students and faculty were taking their money to the Checkerboard Lounge, which is in Brownsville, old blues club owned by Buddy Guy and L.C. Thurman. And they saw that and said, we need to capture and retain the wealth of our affiliates on campus. It's leaving because we spent so much time getting rid of all the retail and mixed development, and now we watch all the money leak away, which is a term that marketers use, leakage, in these instances. And so I watched that, and I was like, damn, like this is deep, and this acquisition of the Checkerboard Lounge is just the tip of the iceberg. And kind of find out that the University of Chicago runs the South Side, that a brick cannot be laid without getting the cosign of U Chicago. And I was talking to people about it. Well, you got to talk about these. This is just one school. There's other schools here that you got to talk about. So my good colleague and one of my former mentors, Andrew Ross at NYU, was like, he just got done writing a book about environmentalism in Phoenix. Because this book was like, if you can do environmental work in Phoenix, which is anti-environmentalism, you can do it anywhere, right? Where there ain't no water and they got green grass. How's that? That's a side note. But anyway, so he said, you got to go to Phoenix. They just built a downtown campus. This was in 2006. And so I went there, and it was interesting because it's also the biggest public research university in the country. With the main campus at Tempe, as you know, over 50,000 students. But they're saying within the next 10 years, it's going to be a multi-campus, a multi-sited campus with over 100,000 students. So just a monstrosity. So there's that. And then I went to graduate school in New York, and because New York is this capital of finance, I really wanted to talk about how it's become the biggest college town in the country. And that's really talked about, and how the university has become the face for what had previously been the dominant industries of finance, insurance, or real estate. So I wanted to look at NYU and Columbia for that perspective. And then, of course, I was reluctant about this for a long time, but I eventually said, I got to do my home spot. I got to do Trinity. And so the end result is that I had a nice range of schools. So small liberal arts in the Northeast, big private research university in the Midwest, big public research university in the Southwest, and then two big private universities in the capital of industry and finance in terms of New York. And then the conclusion, I was doing a lecture, invited lecture at the University of Winnipeg. I had a colleague who was there previously, and I was doing my talk, and this is actually in the epilogue too. And this guy was with a suit on. I'm like, oh, this cat's trying to come for me. He frowning, he whispering, he genuflecting and everything. And afterwards, he was the first one in line. I was like, okay, let's get it. I was ready to go. But he actually was like, have you seen our campus before? And so I said, no, so let me walk you around. And he was showing me things about what they were doing, not for pure benevolence, but out of kind of survival, how they were offering a more expansive vision of sustainability that was offering different approaches to housing and food and development in ways that we rarely see in the States. And so that became the entry point into my epilogue that looks at solutions in a very practical and real way. And it's important to know this book was written before the summer 2020. And so I think that if it was written after, even some of my solutions would have been even harder. Because just to be quite honest, I was trying to get this book in the hands of policy folk. And I knew if I just went hard, they'd be like, this cat is just, whatever. So I wanted to talk about how some of the things that seem utopian are actually quite practical to get policy folk to hear what I was saying. But I think before the backlash, I think that the dial had shifted enough where I could have even been more explicit in some of the things that I'm saying now with the lab and other things in the book. But again, sometimes we caught up in books and things like that. They're the end point instead of the provocation. And so for me, I don't see the book as the final word on this stuff. It's really the launch pad to have these greater conversations. So I feel blessed about that.
So you so you just went through the sort of list of schools that you covered, and obviously you don't necessarily focus on HBCUs, but I'm interested because as you were talking, I'm thinking, so, I was in undergrad at NCCU at North Carolina Central University in between 2005 and 2009. And I remember in the early 2000s, there was this DVD that came out, which is called Welcome to Durham. And it was about gang life in Durham.
Wow.
And like, they had essentially like, I don't know, the narrative about Durham at the time was that it was essentially Gotham City, right? That's how they talked about it. And then you realize, and this is under a Black mayor, Bill Bell, then you realize this sort of 20-year project that has happened to sort of take, obviously NCCU is not the biggest university, it's Duke, right? Yes. It's interesting because there were a number of struggles between even NCCU as a university, as an HBCU in a Black neighborhood that was attempting to, implement this model, right, to expand, but I think in contention with the Black community that was there, and also while still trying to hold on to this, I think, kind of coveted, maybe morally superior position to Duke in relationship to Black Durham, right? And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about maybe the particularities or the specificities of the ways HBCUs as colleges and universities end up swallowing cities, or even maybe struggle to catch up with the, what it means to compete with these other universities if they choose to or are not choosing to swallow up cities in this particular way. And I'm thinking about it even in the context of the kind of ongoing protests that are happening at Howard and in the AUC, in particular, in relationship to some of these issues around housing, around food services, all these different types of ways that the universities both serve and engage in a sort of extractive, exploitative relationships with these communities?
It's a great question. And, being at least partially historian, and because you are an alum of this world, I think that there are ways in which the kind of neoliberal model of wealth extraction finds its way into HBCUs. But I've had the conversation with people from the outside of our communities, like, that want to make a one-to-one racial comparison. And I'm like, you got to be careful with that, because as we saw recently in the state of Maryland, HBCUs just won a $750 million lawsuit because of the way in which the state unevenly underwrote HBCUs as compared to PWI state institutions. And so there's a way in which the turn to this model by HBCUs is for a different reason, to catch up, to kind of compensate for a loss of capacity and resources that have been systemically racially deprived from these communities. But it doesn't advocate or isolate them from critique, especially in the case of Blackburn takeover. So in the mechanism, the efforts to make up for losses, racially unjust losses, cannot be the university model. And so, I was just at Howard like a little while ago and seeing these luxury apartments coming up and seeing the policy, even before Blackburn takeover, and to see the medical school, even differently than the main campus, doing serious business in the surrounding neighborhoods. And it just shows that universities kind of using the tradition, the Black HBCU tradition, as a way to mask or subterfuge or augment the critique. But I think what's powerful about this next generation of students, like, we grew up with a Black president. That ain't gonna hold. Like we grew up with a Black president. We grew up with Black leadership, and our life chances have not changed. That ain't so. Black faces in high places ain't enough. And so I think it's gonna be really interesting to see what happens with the kind of work that I'm doing, and I want to interface more directly with, when I think about AUC, the first thing that comes to my mind, and I'm a little bit older than y'all, but it's like, the first time I watched School Days, and is that there's that scene where Sam Jackson is, a local, and he giving the college boys the business, and there's this long-standing tension that needs to be engaged, that is playing itself out now on structural terms, in terms of university expansion, the role of HBCU police or public safety. But I do think that there is a capacity, because HBCUs, like I just use Howard for example. There's and Sharice, you'll appreciate this. There's a tradition, like for example, 1930s, when it was a site for the Young Turks. The what Marxists of the chair, if you will. So, Morris Tate, early, when, before he became messed up, E. Franklin Frazier, economists were doing Marxist work.
Abram Harris,
Al Bunch,
Doxy Wilkerson.
Right. So at ABC, right. So this was a space for that. And then we go to the 1960s and 70s. There's the attempts to create the first black university. You got my dude, Jeff Donaldson, who's a part of the Black Arts Movement, comes in and runs fine arts, and they're trying to turn Howard into a black university. So I think that the appeal and the history offers a different set of levers to say that when white schools engage in this process and there's a critique, the critique is seen as a betrayal to the original mission. Whereas from within HBCUs, the critique of this approach can be seen as living up to some of the tradition that exists within the institution, the history of the institution. So I think there's a different moral and cultural lever to play on at HBCUs. Doesn't mean they might not be the same outcomes, but I think that the critique can be seen as a part of the aspiration of the institution, as compared to at primarily white schools. This critique is seen as a betrayal of the institution. So I think it's important to hold space for that, but not to let the institution or the administrators especially off the hook. So to see that conversation outside the building between Debbie Allen and Felicia Rashad and how they went different ways on their analysis, it was deep. People are like, that's Claire Huxtable. And it was like, yo, she is holding carrying water for this university. She's not playing with this. And so
she did it for Bill first. She did it for Bill Cosby first. So what was people expecting?
In another avenue, in another realm, just the consistency in that.
She always be acting befuddled, because even years ago, that conversation between her and Gabrielle Union, and she was just acting like, there's just these things that you experience that I don't experience. Girl, bye. Like, what life are you living?
Bye, Felicia. Right. Literally. Right. Bye, Felicia.
Right.
Part of what
yes. So I think that the point that I want to make is that. Go ahead.
No. Go ahead. I was just going to extend your analysis further into the 90s with the Nia Force uprising, right? When they were protesting they're trying to add this white conservative onto the Board of Regents. It is the same shit, right? Like pushing for it to be a black university and not under the control and tutelage of these white folks. Yeah.
Right. And so I'm just saying that I think that HBCUs are these vibrant sites of struggle because they do have a different trajectory, but at the same time, they can easily be lured, seduced by, and sometimes out of survival, by the neoliberal university model. And I think we need to, be clear about that as well.
I think absolutely. I mean, I would be interested, I don't know, what your trajectory is in terms of thinking about it, but when you say you're thinking about policies, I would be interested in because I've really, since I've witnessed that as an undergrad, I'm really interested in how do these HBCUs sort of contend with that model and continue to grow, because it's true. Like NCCU and A&T are they're the top sort of biggest premier HBCUs in the state, public institutions, but the amount of funding that they get and the way that they exist in the communities pale in comparison to UNC Chapel Hill and NC State as public institutions, right? So like maybe not even directly doing the one-to-one comparison with Duke, because that's a whole other machine, but they from the UNC system, right. Like we get pennies, right? So I mean, it would be interesting to think about how do they really think about responsible growth and expansion and incorporation into the community as opposed to kind of a takeover in that way. And I don't have the answers to it. I'm not even necessarily asking that question. I think thinking about it.
But I think that especially because I think community colleges, not just Black ones, but Black and white ones, are doing things differently even today. And in the conclusion, I offer solutions, and I think they could equally apply, maybe even more so, to HBCUs as a different vision of sustainability, especially because of their underfunding by the state. So we could talk about that in detail later if you want, but if we have time permitting, or people can pick up the book as well, but I think that can apply equally to HBCUs in powerful ways in terms of because they're facing defunding and an oppositional stance to the state.
Yeah, and I think that this conversation is really interesting just in terms of like the HBCU renaissance, right? And so there is a way that I think were facing defunding at a particular historical moment, but at least with this white liberal guilt money, this George
Right.
Floyd money, as we might call it, there's an influx, right? And then people are talking about this return to HBCUs, and then there's all this discourse about pushing athletes, premier athletes, to go to HBCUs to generate revenue. And so I think that this question of space and the question of how are they going to expand is going to become increasingly important.
It's critical because like when this money comes in, so what model is this money going to get funneled through? Is it going to be through an equitable, sustainable model, or is it going to just be a corporate model that ramps up and follows the university vision that we see at predominantly white institutions? That's a vital question because we know that, you know, we see how horrible these athletic coaches are doing at white schools. So we pump this money into the athletic department. Is it going to be a small little island of prosperity amidst these schools? Is it going to be distributed evenly to help pay for equitable schools so we don't have to rely on corporate subcontractors to do food services and housing like we see it, Howard? Is it going to be a different model? I mean, we have stories in the past. In the book, I talk about when Lane became Crane Junior College became Malcolm X Community College, and but because it was in the moment of the revolutionary spirit of the 1960s, they rejected what had been a corporate junior college model. They created one of the first prison annexes for incarcerated residents. They fired the off-duty police that were patrolling their campus and hired a black-owned security team that was unarmed. So they chose not just they got money, they took control of the institution, but they chose a different town gown or university community model. And that's what's going to be required. It can't just be the money getting funneled into this. So it's a critical question. It's a critical point. And we'll see in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. So just switching gears a little bit, I want to speak a little bit about policing. In May, you wrote a piece for the Chronicle called Why We Should Abolish the Campus Police. And you also talk about policing throughout the text. And then so I'm just wondering, what is the intersection of policing and the university? And how did this relationship develop? And also, how has it become more entrenched? And then also, can you speak about how the 1970s Scranton Report or the President's Commission on Campus Unrest Report sort of was the catalyst for the buildup of campus police forces?
Okay, so let's just start with a couple of facts and numbers about the reality that we're facing. I think people don't always recognize the magnitude of campus policing. So most schools, 75%, have campus police departments, not public safety, campus police. Nearly all carry guns, and about 9 in 10 have arrest and patrol jurisdictions beyond the main campus. So that's what I want people to just like sit with that fact as a ground floor understanding. So to bring in the analysis that I bring forward in the book, in the building out of these knowledge communities as campuses expand beyond the main perimeters, armed police forces are being unleashed on largely working class neighborhoods and communities of color that surround campuses in our name, because we're all university affiliates. I'm saying our in this regard, in our name. So with such reach, influence, and largely private authority, today's concerns about the militarization and limited oversight in policing that we see going on in cities and towns all over the country are largely campus police issues. So what's the myth? The myth is that campus police are marketed as agents of student or community safety. But what are the biggest crimes on campuses? Sexual violence and substance abuse. Campus police do a horrible job of policing those crimes. Some might say infrastructure, I would say intent, because it's the university brand. What university wants to publicize that they have a campus full of white criminals? So what is the reality? These campus police are not on their campuses. They are all out in the neighborhoods around the campus, as I said before, to say to families, to researchers and investors that these Black and brown neighborhoods are open for business. We got them on lock. Bring your money. It's safe. Bring the innovation, bring the knowledge, bring the dollars. So basically, these frontline security forces in the violent confiscation and control of areas targeted for university expansion. Especially when we look at, well, what are the actual needs when it comes to public safety in Woodlawn, in Kenwood, in Washington Park, just to talk about Chicago for a minute. The public safety needs are housing, trauma, and healthcare, with a massive medical complex that only because of years of student and community protests finally begins to attend to gunshot wounds, right? So you got this behemoth of prosperity where most of the residents are relegated to pressing their noses against the glass, looking on the inside, only to come on campus to work, to clean up behind the students and the faculty. That's the dynamic. And the police manage that function. So when Johns Hopkins was about to put their private security force, with the multi-million-dollar help of their former alum, former Mayor Bloomberg, into West Baltimore, I talked to State Senator Mary Washington, who was an alum, a PhD, and Johns Hopkins is under her jurisdiction. And she said this is akin to putting a Vatican City in the middle of Baltimore, because it's a private university. And just to be clear, if it's a private school, they are not like any other private institution. The police are not subject to Freedom of Information Act laws. So they can do their business and not have to tell anybody about it. So these are basically private security forces armed with public authority without any public oversight. So this is what she meant by a Vatican City in the middle of Baltimore. This is going on all over the country. In New Haven, Yale's police have jurisdiction over the entire city. In Chicago, University of Chicago police have jurisdiction wherever there is a campus building. How does this happen? There are these unspoken memorandums of understanding between the city and the campuses to allow these universities to police how they want in ways that will bring revenue, resources, and residents to these cities in ways that the cities want. Again, that interest convergence. So the result in most of these cases, we have a two-tier policing system where a student, predominantly white, and a resident, predominantly non-white, can commit the same infraction. The student goes to see the dean of students, and resident goes through the criminal justice system. A two-tiered policing system that basically upholds and serves as a private security force to maintain order, land, and prosperity in these university developments. So how did we get here? Real quickly, as you pointed out, with what's been called the Scranton Commission, the presidential commission that was 1970s, it's not a mistake this came out in the 70s, because this is a period of profound social unrest and the efforts primarily with the rise of Black studies, which went far beyond today's DEI and just putting Black faces in the curriculum and Black faces in the administration. At this time, they were clear. The things at the end of the book were being discussed as a part of Black studies in this critical moment, that you got to have housing for residents, you got to have food services, you got to have public safety, which is more expansive. Their vision, Wesleyan, of all places, when Black studies came online with Wesleyan, one of the first things they did was build affordable housing for residents in Middletown, right? So we don't know enough about this history. And so policing came online. So just to go back to it, this police commission wrote this presidential report because of social unrest that came, as we all know, out of Jackson State, Kent State, and other unrest that was taking place all over the country. Because what we focus on anti-war movements. We talk less about how Black studies and other folks were trying to take over and reimagine universities. And universities at the time were a key lever in military industrial buildup. And so their taking over these universities was a direct threat to what was becoming the information, knowledge, service economy. We don't talk about it in these terms. They needed this commission to re-examine and reframe the new developments. So I took some time with this commission. It's really interesting because on one hand, it tries to maintain space for what is called legitimate and peaceful forms of unrest. What does it call legitimate dissent? Holding meetings, picketing, vigils, demonstrations, and marches. But it also attempts to define disruptive protest just as broadly as anything that, quote, interferes with the normal activities of the university or the right of others to carry on their affairs. So what they're saying, anything that disrupts business as usual, as universities are becoming primary fulcrums in the political economy, is now being redefined as disruptive disruptive, right? Anything that stops business from going on. And we lose that we celebrate that how it created space. We want to maintain space for legitimate protests, but it was also defining protests in ways that eliminated the possibilities for directly engaging in the new political and social economy of universities. Because what did it ban? What did it say was disruptive? Obstructive sit-ins, interference with classroom teaching, blockading recruiters. So all the things that students were trying to directly contest as the face of the university in this developing new economy were now redefined as disruptive. So I think it's critical to understand that. So on one hand, it says, we can't have the National Guard on our campuses. But what does this open the door for? This opens the door for the domestication of militarized violence and the rise of campus police. This is the critical moment when campus police explodes on campuses all over the country. And if we read this document against the grain, it's opening the door for the militarization of domestic policing on campuses. That's what's going on. So
well, they directly recommend that campuses securitize because precisely so the National Guard doesn't come in and shoot all these people down, because the National Guards were the ones shooting these people down. So thank you for that rundown. I think that everybody read this Scranton report. Everybody talking about the Kerner Commission report. The Scranton report is as important as the Kerner Commission report when it comes to how dissent was managed from the 1970s onward. So anyway.
No, I was just thinking, it's another anecdote, not necessarily a question, but again, so I was at NCCU when the Duke lacrosse scandal happened, and I remember, and I did my PhD at Duke, and I distinctly, you're just giving me context for thinking about some of the things that happened, because I distinctly remember, even beyond the walls of Duke, living in the community, when white boys, frat boys would have parties and would be wilding and terrorizing the neighborhoods that they live in.
Right.
And now, not me, because I ain't never called 911 for nobody, but I would know when the police would get called, and I would always be curious about why Duke police were responding as opposed to Durham police were responding. And thinking about this, and I don't even know if that got amped up post Duke lacrosse scandal, but so much of it was about controlling the image and the narrative of what Duke was. And so to be able to intervene, and this sort of the in terms of the information that they even have to share, them being able to intervene in disputes between these rich white frat boys and the community, and only being accountable to the university, it's just like, I don't know, it's just I'm thinking about all these things and appreciating the context.
That's exactly what it is. And just to add to your point, these police become the velvet hammer front line for the campus expansion to come, because in policing these blocks that don't even have campus buildings, they are managing public behavior based on the interests of the university in ways that set the table for the buildings to come. And that's the part we need to really get up on. And this is especially happening in Chicago, where the Chicago police have jurisdiction all the way from 35th and State all the way down to Woodlawn. So I spent a lot of time in my Chicago tribe to talk to Brandy Parker, who was my main informant on policing, who was like, when he was young, he would try to figure out ways to avoid. He had to get across campus to get to the bus he needed. He tried to figure out all these ways to avoid going on campus because of the ways he would get surveilled. But by the time he became 17, it didn't matter, because campus police had jurisdiction in his own neighborhood. He couldn't get away from it. So just to confirm and just to co-sign what you were saying about North Carolina.
No, it's crazy. Well, maybe we can end on a slightly higher note. So you've already referenced, you've already started to talk about the experience you had in Canada at the University of Winnipeg. And, one of the things that is interesting, I'm thinking about the how much this occurrence of another world, you use the phrase another university is possible. I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit more about, one, what you saw, what you witnessed at the University of Winnipeg that was different. About the way universities operate. And then if you could give us your sense of what that other university is that's possible. And then even if it's possible, what is the sort of practical applicability of that in the context of these sort of US cities? And then what's the work that the Smart Cities Lab is doing to help us think about these things, and taking up the mantra that you use, which is development, well, the mantra that's sort of moving and you try to utilize, which is development without displacement.
Right. Okay, that's okay. All right, let's go. Yeah, so when I was at the University of Winnipeg giving this lecture, and they were putting me up on like how things actually are working up there, I just want to be clear at first, because I've gotten hit a little bit on this, and I talk about it in the book, but I talk about it in my first initial lectures, is that it wasn't like the university was doing this out of the kindness of their heart. And there are real problems with some of the things the university had done before. But to their credit, so they had done some of the back buildings with their back space in the community. They had demolished some neighborhood community buildings to make way for campus buildings. They were doing, they did all of that. And so, but to their credit, when they saw that the demographics of the university was changing, that it wasn't the typical white commuter students that was coming to their school, they're in the 2000s, their demographic, their population grew from 6,000 students to 10,000 students, and a large portion of those students came from the indigenous community that surround the university. If you don't know, the province in Manitoba has the largest indigenous community in North America, and so for people of color, or that would be that community. That's the significant community. And so they knew that in order to capture and maintain and sustain relation on their campuses, they couldn't just see individual units of a student going to school and then being fully supported and going home. That to capture and to maintain relationships with this indigenous population and the students that were coming on campus, they had to offer supports, not just for the individual student, but for their families and the communities where they came from, if they were going to sustain this student body. So they began to build out their own campus residential housing that wasn't just the typical dormitory style housing. They also built out townhouse style housing for families that was at rent geared to income rates. They encouraged the student government who controls the on-campus child care center to expand it to offer access and lottery slots to residents in these new homes. They built a downtown commons residential district that had housing at multiple levels and multiple housing points. So premium rate, market rate, affordable housing rate, rent geared to income. And the only difference is that the premium rates had balconies, but the premium rates help underwrite all the rest of the building. And these other units, both market rate and rent geared to income, interchangeable. You couldn't tell, there was no difference in the units. On top of that, they had free Wi-Fi. They have free Wi-Fi in common areas if you can't afford Wi-Fi in your private unit. They redid the ventilation system so that it would allow for cultural practices like smudging that are so central to the indigenous communities. They had free charging stations for electric cars on the ground floor. So just a very different approach. They fired Aramark, one of these multinational food service companies. They fired them, created their own diversity foods, where 65% of the employees are from difficult to employ communities, so LGBTQ, First Nation, what they call New Canadian, what we call immigrant communities, recently incarcerated, and that they're trying to move from to include not just wages, but shares. So they will be shareholders in that company. On the food side, 65% of the food that they procure comes from local small farms within a 100-kilometer radius. They have compost stations next to each workstation. I went through the kitchen. They have compost stations next to each workstation, and they send their cooking oil out to be converted into biodiesel. So this is very different than the U.S. model. But to be clear, there was a urban studies professor by the name of Jim Silver who's like, listen, most of the indigenous residents on the North End will never come to this campus. We need to be in the indigenous community on the North Side. So he got money from the province and built out a educational living annex in largely indigenous North End. And he applauds the main campus work, but he says That's not even enough. We need to be in the community. And he converted a former single room occupancy housing complex that had become a heroin shooting den. He converted it into an educational, learning, housing, food service corridor direct. So, I just use that when I talk to administrators, they got their arms crossed and say, "Oh yeah, another academic being critical. What's your solutions?" I'm like, listen, that's possible. You need to get up on that. This is within the realm of possibility. And then from that, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say, it's making me think about Paul Quinn College, and I think it's in Texas. When they determined that, when the president there determined that sports wasn't really doing nothing for them, they turned the football field into a farm, essentially. And so they're actually producing the food for the university students. And then it was also like a sort of service learning project for the students. So the students actually had to work and maintain it for classes and grades. And so just thinking about even some of the schools in the US that are attempting to create sustainable models. So sorry, I didn't.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, that's right. And there are examples all throughout, and especially during the pandemic. So for example, Chicago during the pandemic, they started taking, because of health, health codes, universities throw out tons of food every day. And people have been critical of that for years, but during the pandemic, Chicago began to convert that food into healthy meals for communities of need. But people were like, how come this wasn't the norm all the time? Right? So the pandemic forced and showed us that the things that we saw as impossible were well within our reach. And so from this research, I started building out the Smart Cities Lab, primarily as an information clearinghouse to share information. But during the pandemic and after after the unrest of 2020, communities like, listen, we don't want your information. We need your advocacy, right? And so through the lab, I've been working directly with communities and universities like Carnegie Mellon and their Institute for Shared Prosperity, and Minnesota Transform at the University of Minnesota, and my great colleagues at the University of Miami are building out this amazing Black Miami project out of their Center for Urban Global Studies, Global Black Studies. And so that's going on the community level. If you might have heard that recently, New Haven Rising, a community group, was able to push Yale to contribute $53 million over 6 years to compensate for property tax losses, which again is peanuts compared to their $40 billion endowment. But it demonstrates that universities do have a fiscal responsibility to the universities, because it's something they've been denying for decades, right? That universities want to talk about themselves, and we get caught up in this myth of the schoolhouse. So urban engagement is primarily tutoring and turkey giveaways and educational outreaches. But because of the ways in which universities are so pervasive in our lives in terms of housing and healthcare and policing, any kind of urban engagement has to match the degree to which universities are in our lives. And so this is what I'm calling for in this Smart Cities research. And so this new work with the lab is trying to speak to that and pierce through the myth of the university as primarily a schoolhouse or a research institution that produces life-saving discoveries that we can't afford them, right? So if you're gonna produce life-saving discoveries on tax-exempt land, then you need to pay down on that Moderna and Pfizer vaccination that you get millions of dollars in royalties for helping. Or Eli Lilly at Princeton making millions of dollars in royalties with Eli Lilly and then producing these life-saving discoveries, and yet you don't pay property taxes in your community, in your hood. You like come up off them dollars if you want to talk about urban outreach. So this is what the Smart Cities Lab is saying, things like this. And so right now we're pairing also with the Black bottom community in Philadelphia, in West Philadelphia, that was just rocked and displaced during that moment I talked about earlier during the 112 credits program. But we did some research and discovered that the early negotiations between student activists and community activists and UPenn and Drexel was that this area that became University City was supposed to be a mixture of campus buildings, but also spot-sited affordable housing units. Right now, there's only one affordable housing unit left called University City Townhouse. I want to amplify this. And because this area is ripe for revitalization, because private developers want to partner with the universities in this area, so this townhouse is being displaced. So as part with the Black Bottom Tribe, Smart Cities is partnering with Congresswoman Jamie Gautier to build out a full inclusionary housing overlay over this area to at least control and allow for Black and brown residents to stay in this area as it gets scaled up for revitalization. Now, the real estate and development community, I testified when the pilot got approved to go to a full vote, and the real estate community was there in full force going at it. So, these struggles are real. But I'm gonna tell you, this is the kind of work that I really, coming out of African American studies and American studies, this is the kind of work that I want to be doing for the rest of my life. It's great to write the book, but for it to be a platform to be able to engage in these conversations and to actually push forward policy and to have a hand, even if it's small, in forcing Yale to pay up some dough that they were unwilling to pay up, to change the conversation, to give land to activists and community thinkers, to give them history, to provide the things that we can provide to social movements. These are the kind of things that I believe in. And so when I talk about abolition from a university standpoint, on reparations work, as part of Smart Cities Lab, we call for school reparations from slavery, Jim Crow, and urban renewal practices. But we also call for payments in lieu of university tax exemption. We call on schools to reserve a portion of their tax exempt endowments community projects. We call for university medical centers to honor their mandate of indigent care that provides their tax exemption. We call on schools to attach a community benefits agreement to any campus expansion project. They can include affordable housing mandates, zip code specific jobs, job training, scholarships, and direct access to campus facilities. We watch schools throw away food daily and demand they package that food into healthy meals regularly. Finally, we assess the failure of campus police to address the primarily white crimes of sexual assault, substance abuse, and you watch their jurisdiction extend into our communities and engage in racial profiling that absolves students and arrest residents. They fail on all accounts. Therefore, we demand the abolition of campus police to be replaced with teams of preventative outreach and trauma care from these behemoth hospitals that meets actual campus and community safety needs. Right before our eyes, schools have used their wealth built on slavery, segregation, and urban renewal to become the biggest low-wage employers, landholders, healthcare providers, and policers in major cities and college towns across the country. We must instigate a forensic accounting of the comprehensive damage and then develop a vision of repair. And I'm not against higher education. Schools have the capacity to do great things, but because their wealth and prosperity has been directly drawn from our misery, it's time to repurpose the buildings, reclaim the classrooms and cafeterias and playing fields. I'm just saying that we can build a beloved community that meets the needs of a higher education. Universities, their mantra, their claim to fame is solving the world's most difficult problems. Why not start with the problems in your own backyard?
Period. So I think that this is such a high note to end on. I think the work that you're doing with Smart Cities Lab is amazing. The book is great and very readable, by the way. There's nothing pedantic or confusing or highfalutin about it. I think it's very practical, especially because you do end with solutions. So thank you so much for coming and sharing broad knowledge with our audience. And we hope to have you back to come and talk more soon.
Thank you so much. This is a great conversation. And, I've been following Dope Intellectual for a long time, since it came out, and the community building is amazing. And I'm happy and proud to be a part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, y'all, we're bringing back a segment from season 1, History of the Present, where we examine a historical quote in terms of its relevance for today. And we got a very interesting topic that frames this segment. Layla, what are we talking about?
So for today, we're talking about class suicide, and in our context, revolutionary class suicide. I think it's something that has been animating. It animates the Last Dope Intellectual in general, but it's definitely been a general undercurrent for the season, the last couple episodes. And so I wanted us to think today about how people are theorizing, thinking about revolutionary class suicide and what that might look like for us.
Exactly. So we have a few quotes to frame the conversation. So I'll start because with a quote from Cabral, because he explicitly explains like what this is, and then I'll read a related quote by Rodney. So Cabral says in his article, or it was a speech, The Weapon of Theory from 1966, given at the Tricontinental Conference. He says, quote, "The petty bourgeoisie has only one choice: to strengthen its revolutionary consciousness, to reject the temptations of becoming more bourgeois and the natural concerns of its class mentality, to identify itself with the working classes, and not to oppose the normal development of the process of revolution. This means that in order to truly fulfill the role in the national liberation struggle, the revolutionary petty bourgeoisie must be capable of committing suicide as a class in order to be reborn as revolutionary workers, completely identify with the deepest aspirations of the people to which they belong." And then a related quote from Walter Rodney from The Groundings with My Brother. He says, "The Black intellectual, the Black academic must attach himself to the activity of the Black masses." Later on, he says, "All white people are enemies until proven otherwise, and this applies to Black intellectuals. All of us are enemies of the people until we prove otherwise."
And so, kind of continuing in the vein of thinking about the role of the intelligentsia, in his book, Class Struggle in Africa, which was published in 1970, Kwame Nkrumah says the following: "It is the task of the revolutionary intelligentsia to enunciate and promulgate African revolutionary socialist objectives and to expose and refute the deluge of capitalist propaganda and bogus concepts and theories poured out by the imperialist, neo-colonialist, and indigenous reactionary mass communications media. Where socialist revolutionary intellectuals have been part of genuinely progressive administrations in Africa, it has usually been through the adoption of Marxism as a political creed and the formation of communist parties or similar organizations which bring them into constant close contact with workers and peasants. Intelligentsia and intellectuals, if they are to play a part in the African Revolution, must be conscious of the class struggle in Africa and align themselves with the oppressed masses. This involves the difficult but not impossible task of cutting themselves free from bourgeois attitudes and ideologies imbibed as a result of colonialist education and propaganda."
All right, so I have Franz Fanon from Wretched of the Earth. This is the Pitfalls National Consciousness chapter. So the general chapter is it's a lot of scolding of the petty bourgeois in the national liberation struggle in general. So I got two quotes here. Says, "To educate the masses politically cannot mean making a political speech. What it means is to try relentlessly and passionately to teach the masses that everything depends on them, that if we stagnate, it's their responsibility, and that if we go forward, it's due to them too, that there is no such thing as a demiurge, and there is no famous man who will take the responsibility for everything, but that the demiurge is the people themselves, and the magic hands are finally only the hands of the people." Earlier in the chapter, he says, "The African politicians should not be preoccupied with turning out sportsmen, but with turning out fully conscious men who play games as well. If games are not integrated into national life, that is to say, in the building of the nation, if you turn out national sportsmen and not fully conscious men, you will very quickly see sport rotted by professionalism and commercialism."
So part of the reason why we're thinking about, I think, class suicide from my perspective and from Layla's perspective as academics is because one of the questions is like, how do we do this shit? How do we do our jobs like ethically and with the eye toward not reproducing the litany of problems that emanate from being an academic? And it reminds me of like the distinction between, you know, and thinking with the quote too that you read to Black about sport, right? It reminds me of like the entertainment class versus people who produce art, culture workers, right? And so likewise, as knowledge workers, how do we do the work of recovery, of accountability to the past and the present, what you know, Manning Marable talks about, description, correction, and prescription. Like, how do we do that work without becoming entrapped in the bourgeois ideologies, values, and logics like meritocracy, which is not a thing in academia, by the way. You know what I mean? Like, you know, not standing in solidarity with other types of workers, with precarious workers on the campus, treating our students in a very top-down manner, all of those things that I think reproduce the power dynamics in our society. And it's particularly pernicious for students because we're continuing to normalize that dynamic that they already were inculcated in K through 12 education. If we continue those logics and those dynamics in our classrooms, or in our mentorship, et cetera, then we're continuing to normalize that. And I think that part of what we want to, I can speak for myself, but I think Layla shares this, is that we want to be able to do our jobs, but do it in a way that doesn't cause like profound alienation from our love of scholarship and research and learning. And so, and this is not reducible to academia, but that's our sort of locus of enunciation, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, even for me, one of the things, so you all know that this weekend I participated in the Summit for Socialist Democracy. And in the Q&A, one of the questions that was asked, and I think this is asked and discussed and talked about in a number of ways, even on the show, is this question of accessibility of information, right? And so like one of the people who asked the question said something about like, I noticed a lot of jargon and sometimes like, words that were difficult to comprehend. And I think that for a lot of people, for them, if we're actually talking about building mass revolutionary movements, that's something that we have to take seriously. That doesn't necessarily mean that in certain aspects of the work that we do, that we don't strive for a particular kind of specificity and clarity in terms of word use or whatever. But this is in part what I think we are doing with this podcast. And I think, and this is why, like, we will often talk about whether or not it's useful for us to keep doing this. Are we just sort of adding to the noise? But the thing that I think about is that I don't necessarily know that people ask that same question about books, right? Like, we continue to produce and people will read them or not read them. I think that what we do in the confines of this podcast is that we are attempting to have, I think, fairly common level conversations, even if they are complex topics, but the sort of complexity of the conversation is such that it is accessible to a general kind of audience. It exposes people to ideas. But the thing that I think is important about learning complex subject matter or even understanding jargon is that none of us comes out of the womb knowing how to do these things, and that it is always the product of a collective process. And so like one of my answers to him, to the person, I don't know if they were him or not, but to the person that asked the question, was that one of the ways that things become less convoluted is through increased exposure, right? So reading and talking about things over and over again, asking these questions, and they're not things that we can do by ourselves. This is not something that you go sit in a corner and read by yourself. We have to be engaged in collective forms of study and struggle. And that study, again, I think people relegate it exclusively to reading, but it's not exclusively to reading. Study is about observing phenomenon, and it is about giving credit to people who have studied and observed that phenomenon and have made certain observations about it, right? And so this is what we have even in this conversation. When Cabral begins to theorize this concept of revolutionary class suicide, he's talking about what's necessary from his own perspective as somebody who grew up relatively well off. I mean, all of our great thinkers, that's who they would be. Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Kwame Nkrumah. All of these people are people who are
not Claudia. Claudia wasn't in factories working, period.
Not all of them, but many of them are people who had access to certain things and chose to use them to different ends. And I think that you do this through grounding, right? This is the purpose of what Rodney's ideas about groundings with our brothers is to be able to have these conversations and flesh out these ideas and struggle with each other, not just struggle in terms of like warfare, but also struggle over thought and ideology.
First, to speak to the show, this particular show, and when people talk about accessibility and stuff of that nature, I mean, I think sometimes those critiques are fair when it comes to the way language gets used, or maybe certain levels of knowledge that might go over people's heads. I think that sometimes that's fair, and there's definitely a conversation to be had about that. I think though, when I think about this show, and just the privilege of being on it with, you know, 2 Black women PhDs. And I think there are the people who are interested in this show are going to most often be probably, you know, academic adjacent or somewhere in that nature. And I think that that's fine, because if you listen to, or if you read the Cabral, there's no audio, but if you read the Cabral speech, he's, you know, he gets to class, he actually uses the term class suicide pretty much towards the very end. Like, it's like the second to last paragraph, I think. But he's speaking about like the petty bourgeoisie and how you grow up in the colonial situation, and how you inherit the knowledge that is helpful to, you know, to bring about revolution, but you also can use that knowledge to just continue on the same situation. So once neocolonialism comes in, you can just seize the power, you can just become the, you know, the kind of like front dictator of the situation, even though we know white capital is still behind it. So he's talking about like within that struggle, we need to make a choice. And he's talking about with, you know, internally. So for that class of people who are in those spaces, I think a show like this is to challenge them as well. I think sometimes we always want to consider like the most marginalized or whatever, but I think there's something to be said about the people who are in the academy who we know are getting bullshit, or even if they're not in the academy, the people who are of a particular class who are getting bullshit. Like, what is the alternatives for them? You know, and this isn't to make it like, oh, woe is me, they have the worst situation. I'm just saying, like, those are the people who inherit, you know, these positions of power, you know, relative to the society in this neo-colonial situation. And they're the ones that end up going out doing a lot of bullshit we were talking about at the beginning of the show, the gossiping and stuff of that nature. So what do we have to discipline them? Like, I always say, when people say we're preaching to the choir, I was like, the choir sucks. The choir can't sing. The choir's got bad tubes. Like, the choir needs work too. I wouldn't even want to bring anybody into this church based on the way the choir acts sometimes. So, like, what do you do to discipline the choir? And I think that he's getting at that. Like, what do we do for that particular class of people? So for the people who relate to this show, I'm not saying everybody is of that class either, but I'm saying for the people who are, I think they need something different too. They need something beyond the kind of neoliberal politics that they get, you know, in most of these spaces.
It's true. And, you know, I think I have always been of the opinion, right? I guess it's my revisionism, that I think we need to organize from below, but there's we got to flip some people in the middle and at the top, if only to redistribute some of those resources. Like, I really do think, because these classes exist, they just do. And so we can't ignore the fact that they exist. I don't know about not me and Layla's class, not the petty bourgeois, but like the elite, they have the monopoly on violence, the monopoly on force, right? And so I think that the more that we can flip people at all, or let's not even say flip, the more consciousness can be raised at all levels, the better off the masses will be, period. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, only focusing our attention on that, to me, is akin to people who try to like cancel celebrities. Root out whatever transphobia, homophobia, misogyny you see in your organizations. That's going to have a much more actual impact on the day-to-day realities of people you struggle with and you care about. And it's more than just sort of like virtue signaling. The other thing that I wanted to say too is it's not just about accessibility. It's also about like, how do you live your life? You know, if we are socialists and we believe in redistribution, like how are we oriented toward our resources? Like, do we share? Are we kind beyond just buy my mama a house? Like, that's important, but it's like, how do you think about your responsibility to community, knowing that you have more than others? And so it can be something as simple as, if you're going even on a fringe trip and you know that you make the most money, you pay more because you got more, right? And it's not this weird liberal equality where it's like, well, everybody pays the same. That's not how that works. It's so like, how do you do things that people who don't have that much resources can participate in? Do you even take that into account, right? So I think that all of those things matter and have to do with class suicide, because part of being of a class is being invested in reproducing that class, which means taking on the values, taking on the actions, the principles, and the ethics that are inscribed in that class. And so part of class suicide is like, I'm not doing that shit. And not only, and it's an individual responsibility, but it's also in a way that's articulated to a broader political struggle and a broader commitment to like social transformation, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing about this, that our own, even if we consider ourselves to be educated, we consider ourselves to be revolutionary, radical, whatever, it is always an ongoing process. And that the idea of disabusing ourselves of bourgeois aspirations is something that we have to be constantly engaged in. And so even I mean, it was basically alluded to in all of the quotes that we read, but that again, that it is a conscious choice that we must make. To your point, CBS, even we are educated in these schools that hope that we will produce the status quo, that we will reproduce the status quo. And that the only way we can begin to actually do our jobs, if we consider ourselves radical revolutionary intellectuals or whatever field we're in, is to do our best not to reproduce that. And a lot of that has to do with, one, constantly recommitting ourselves to what these principles are, knowing what they are, and not necessarily only existing sort of within those confines. And so for me, like, that's what the podcast also is, right? Like, most people will complain about the sort of the ivory tower or the paywall that often comes with the things that we write or the things that we produce. And that for me, this is as much a personal learning opportunity. Like, I learn as much from our interviewing our guests, reading what they're writing, even engaging with some of the questions and comments that our viewers have, as much as I feel like I'm also contributing something, because I have the luxury of the time and the resources to do so. And so for me, this is a part of the work, like being someone who doesn't necessarily have to, quote unquote, toil daily, and I'm not intellectually, physically, mentally exhausted to the point where I can't do things like this. Like, this is for me, this is a part of that work. And so I see all of these things as a part of that. And that is something that we have to constantly double down on. You can never rest in whatever you think your political position is, because you can always easily find yourself working towards something that you didn't realize.
Backslide.
I just wanted to read another part of Cabral from that speech, just so people I don't think we're doing it, but sometimes people take terms like class suicide and it becomes equivocated with just like, denouncing your privilege or something. And that's not what he's saying. I've seen articles where they try to like make that one-to-one, and that's something else. Denouncing privilege may or may not be the thing, but I'm saying I don't think he's saying exactly that. So he says, the neo-colonial situation in which the working class and their allies struggle simultaneously against the imperialist petty bourgeoisie and the native ruling class is not resolved by a nationalist solution. It demands the destruction of the capitalist structure implanted in the national territory by imperialism, and correctly postulates a socialist solution. So he was very explicit about what it was going to take. So you simply just saying that, I'm a privileged whatever type of person, and I denounce my privilege, I'm going to use my privilege. That's getting there. Like, you can get to class suicide, but I just don't want it to be this thing where that gets equated to the same thing. Like, he's talking about a national liberation struggle and what that solution needs to be. We're talking about overthrowing imperialism and colonialism. That's not the same as just giving scholarships to black kids in the hood. I'm not against that, but I'm just saying I just get tired of sometimes we talk about our terms getting co-opted. I'm just trying to draw that line very clearly where these aren't the same things. Like, I don't know if everybody's even ready for class suicide, to be honest with you. I think some people are probably just getting around to the whole privilege talk, right? Like, if you're not ready for that, just be honest about it, but don't say that that's what it is when it's not, because that level of commitment, I think sometimes it's just a commitment that everybody doesn't have. When you're talking about destabilizing an institution that's oppressing you on one side so you can overtake it to help the people in the long run.
Yeah, and related, the other thing that I'm thinking about and related to my rant, I think last week, a couple weeks ago, about allyship can't be a stick up, it also is not manifested in giving away everything that you own, or expecting people who have a little bit more than you to give away all their shit because they have a little bit more, because that's not actually redistribution. right? Those are still the crumbs at the bottom. I think that it is moving in a way that is always cooperative and collective, and that has an eye toward the ways that exploitation and oppression are operating and doing and mitigating that to the best of your ability. But it's also, again, struggling to alleviate those realities, right? So it's not just an individual thing. If I gave all my money away tomorrow, there would still be capitalism. And if I'm not doing more than just giving away my money, that's not really, that's not class suicide. I mean, I played myself because now I'm broke and struggling. I blame myself for real, but it's not just about that. But there does have to be a resource component. And so, our friend Nina, who we've mentioned, Twitter friend, I don't know them in real life, always talks about, is like, it can't just, there has to be some skin in the game. And in a capitalist society, the skin in the game, it has to be some type of material resources. You have to be doing something that, you have to be doing something materially to combat that sort of the selfish individualist ethic and practice in the society, but it can't be reducible to that, right? So.
Yeah, and I just think you need to be honest about what you're doing. It's like I said, it's okay to give that scholarship out. It's okay to help somebody who ain't got money. I mean, like that, like we were talking about how to model things, but that isn't inherently overthrowing the state or something. Like, and I think sometimes people, like we were joking a little bit about the reparations thing, where it's like, here's my Cash App, give me my reparations or whatever. Like, I mean, but these people at some point equate that to actually be reparations. I'm just saying, like, that's why I was just trying to take this hard line. Like, it ain't the same thing. Because I think that for me, it's not just about the words. It's about, like, when you can appropriate certain terms, the level of commitment and sacrifice that you have to make is diminished, because now you can just make it about your own little individual thing. Now it's just recycling, like we talked about. Now it's just that it's not putting you in a position where you're really going to lose anything. So then it definitely couldn't be any type of class suicide, because you're not really losing nothing, right? So yeah, I mean, on the other end, yeah, it's not just simply just giving everything you have automatically just because you don't have anything. But if you're part of a larger project, like, you got people who are making whatever they're making in academia, and then they're getting $100,000 a speech, one has to ask, to talk about the stuff we're talking about, one has to ask, is that really necessary? To make that much money per speech, and then for you to just hold on to all that when you're getting paid to talk about people who are killed on the streets, people who don't have these resources, and that becomes the almost authentic form of blackness, is the poverty version of blackness, is the hood, quote unquote, and then someone else gets to benefit from that. I think that's a real criticism. When you were talking about Nina, that's a criticism that she makes, and I think that's something people should be cognizant of. Like how, or even Dr. James talks about this, just being able to accumulate off of struggle in ways that we just weren't able to do in previous eras. Like those are questions I think that need to be asked. And I think that even goes to what we were talking about at the beginning, as far as like what's just rhetoric. I think CBS said that, what's just rhetoric versus what's just living it out.
Look, if you charging Chase Bank $100,000 to do a talk, fine, they got it, right? But if you are also not, I do think that money should be redistributed. And if you're charging $100,000, a significant portion of that should go toward not just you, right? I do believe that. I mean, now if you're charging a community organization $5,000, $10,000 to speak, that's goofy. Like, don't do that shit, because oftentimes these organizations don't have the resources, and even if they do, they should be going to something else and not paying your goofy ass. So like, I think that's the thing about having the ethics, is being sort of conscious and strategic about why it is that you're, what are you charging, and again, what are you doing with those resources? And it's not about giving everything away, although I do believe that when people die, I don't believe in inheritance. I think when you die, no, everybody start from zero. That's what I think. I really do believe that with all my heart.
I mean, I think this issue goes both ways, because the other thing that we have to be, like, to the point you made earlier, CBS, there's a difference between morally, ethically thinking about redistribution and fetishizing poverty, right? And so like there it is the goal, even as a socialist, right? It is not that we all share poverty. We have an understanding that we can share wealth, that we can all live at a higher standard, right? And now that may mean for some rich people that their standards may come down, but that in general, as people, we can have a higher standard of living than what the masses of people have. And so, I mean, I think that we have to make room for the complexities in all these various scenarios, but that what undergirds it all is a particular kind of ethical, political commitment, and that's what we have to be. And that's what I think the theory of class suicide does for us, is that it is something that that has to constantly animate our work, our understandings of ourselves, how we engage with one another, and that's how we have to live our lives. I mean,
yeah, I think that the other thing all of these people are talking about is being in struggle. The way that you commit class suicide and what prompts one to commit class suicide is being in struggle, is being in sort of politically rooted in the masses, and not in a patronizing or a liberal way where it's like, as you're saying, you fetishize the masses. Because the masses, I mean, the other thing, most of, a lot of Cabral's writing, including his critique of Fanon, is that no group is objectively revolutionary. There are some groups that might be less invested in a project because they benefit the least from it, but that doesn't make them objectively revolutionary. There has to be a particular consciousness raising. So again, it's not an orientation towards the masses in a sort of a fetishizing way that can still also like reproduce hierarchy, but rather like you have to be rooted in something. You have to be around other people who don't, you have to root yourself in something beyond, for our example, like the ivory tower, or beyond whatever bourgeois place you live or industry you're in or whatever. Like you actually have to be struggling. You have to be doing things beyond your immediate reality to even come to that consciousness. And again, as you were saying, Layla, to continue daily to build that consciousness of, not reproducing the bullshit that comes from particular types of class position.
Yeah, and I think even in that quote I read from Fanon, he was like, this is something you have to teach the people, that it depends on them, that if they're stagnant, it's their responsibility. So it's also like relinquishing that sense of you being the top dog too, right? Like that I'm the one that gets to lead the revolution. It's like, no, you let the people know that they're the ones, and we all can be in that struggle. It's not I get to be the one at the front that gives the speeches, that gets all the acclaim. And I think that's another major component of the class we're talking about, is you wanting to be the face of it and get the credit, and you, even if you do give back somewhat to the people, like there's a certain narcissism that can come with that, that I'm the one that frees the folks, and then that's always going to go wrong, because that's not rooted in struggle. That's rooted in your own personality quirks or whatever you got going on. That's not rooted in what we really need. So I think it's also that being able to be like, if I'm gonna be the face of something, then I need to represent it properly for the people. And sometimes I don't actually need to be the one talking. Sometimes, like Yannick said, like take the mic and hand it to the person next to you, because you don't have anything good to say anyway. Or when we were talking about people who come into knowledge about something, which is fine to come into knowledge at whatever phase you come into it, but to come into knowledge and then assume the position like you were always there and like you are the expert of it, and because you have the access to whatever communication channels, all of a sudden we come to you to hear about a particular topic, and then you don't want to cite anybody else that already did that work, whether that's people in the ivory tower or whether that's people who are on the ground struggling. You want to act like you want to inherit all of their struggle. Like those are the things I think that really pisses people off when they're watching these folks on TV or watching them in whatever space. It's like they're basically just thieves in this sense, right? Like they're laundering the shit basically. So it's just like, I think those are the things that I think and that's why I say I think that this particular class needs something to discipline them, like an organizationally, whether it's media or something of that nature, because they need to know those things. I've talked to some of these people, they're so deep in this shit, they don't even know that they're doing this half the time. I'm not saying all of them. Some of them definitely know they're grifting, but some of them I think are so well disciplined to move this way they actually think this is how things should work, which is I think in many ways is worse. But there's not a lot of alternatives for them, you know.
Yeah, I saw some. There's some like liberation coach on Twitter that had, excuse me, on Instagram that had posted something like, how many people or who's liberated somebody today? And then the next slide is like a emoji with the hand raised. And I'm just like, bitch, are you Abraham Lincoln? Like you emancipating people with your program, your 10 steps to live. Anyway, it's that bullshit. Like, that's not cool. But the other thing too, I think, is eschewing that model altogether. There is no reason why the speaker is coupled with the leader. The speaker can just be one position amongst others, right? But there's a way that even it's not just like that whole model, which is a bourgeois model, gets reproduced even in sort of grassroots, regular organizations, where we think that the person who's speaking the most is the leader. That need not be the case, or like that becomes a coveted position. But I think that decoupling that mentality, right? So for example, like people talk about how Black women were the backbone of the civil rights movement. They were making the copies. They were doing all the day-to-day work, but there's still a way that we don't consider them to be the leaders of the movement. We still will talk about how Black men were problematically the leaders of the movement because we see people because we still understand people being the face of the movement as being the leaders. And I think that, again, we need to get rid of that fucking model where just because you're the one talking on TV, or just because the person who's talking on TV is the one that is not, we don't need to see those people as the ones that are the most powerful or the ones who actually are the leaders, are the leaders. So we ourselves need to move away from that understanding in general, Yeah. All right, y'all. So my rant for this week is very short and simple. I really wish y'all would stop saying fucking classism. Classism is not a thing. And I feel like it came about because of the race, class, gender triad. We got racism, we got sexism. So, classism. But classism doesn't it obfuscates what is being described. So we could be talking about capitalist exploitation. We could be talking about class antagonism, which is a sort of struggles that different classes engage in that have very real material consequences. We could be talking about what I think often was being referred to as like class bias. So the sort of disdain or stereotype or condescension that might come from a higher class person vis-a-vis a lower class person or toward a lower class person or a class in general. But just say class bias thing, because when you talk about classism, and what can tend to happen is that sort of moral or ideational or perception that perception aspect that's being described can overdetermine what the material relations that class is supposed to be describing. So all of that to say, stop fucking saying classism, say class antagonism, say class bias, say class prejudice, say whatever, but don't say classism. It's not a thing. And stop. And I wish people would stop trying to make the shit happen. Okay? Stop.
All right, y'all. That is our show for this Friday evening. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you are here with us. So thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. Brown, here with my girl, Dr. CBS. And thanks as always to Two Black in the Back. And we are signing off.
Peace.